All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome back to the crash course in human vision. In the morning session, we talked a lot about early visual stages, so basic image formation, basic filters, color processing, motion processing. These are all fairly basic features for the visual system. And in the afternoon session, we're going to be moving into slightly higher level visual topics. So I'm going to start out talking about kind of the mid-level perception of 3D depth. And then John will be talking about attention, and then Drew will be back, and also Maz talking about much higher level processing and actually recognizing objects. I've talked to you a little bit about motion perception, and motion perception, part of what it does for you is gives you 3D structure of the world. But now I'm going to back up a little bit and talk about, in general, how you can perceive 3D depth. So there's kind of two major sources of information about 3D depths in the world. One of them is the binocular signal that you're getting because you have two eyes. But there's also a lot of monocular image cues. So even if you don't have two eyes, or if you're looking at photographs, or if you have a computer vision system that only uses photographs, there are tons of single image cues to depth. And after talking to you about the depth cues that the visual system uses, I'll sort of separately talk about how you interpret object size. So obviously, interpreting the real world size of an object is very much related to your perception of the 3D structure of a scene. But there's also some cool, interesting differences there. So first off, how do we extract the stereo cue from the two eyes, combine the two images to get a sense of depth? The main cue that you use for binocular stereo perception is disparity. So disparity is the difference between the images that are going to the two eyes. So in this diagram, we've got the eyes on the bottom. We're imagining that they've fixated on the closer of those two rods. So what's the image that goes to each eye? Well, in each eye, the close rod is centered in the image, and the farther rod is sort of to the left, because it's behind it and slightly to the left. But the distance to the left is different between the two eyes, because it's shown by these angles. They've each got slightly different views. So to compute disparity, you would compute the angle between the retinal position of the one object in the left eye and the far object in the left eye, difference of retinal position of the near object in the right eye, far object in the right eye. Those distances are different. That means there's some kind of change in depth between these two objects. So we have binocular stereo because we have two eyes. A lot of animals with two eyes actually don't have very good stereo perception. So to have stereo, you need the two eyes oriented forward so they both get the same view of the world, or at least well overlapping views. A lot of animals like mice, rabbits, deer, horses, they have the eyes oriented much more on the side of the head, so they have a much wider field of view than humans. Like mice basically have 360-degree views all around themselves, but they have much less stereo perception in the middle. So the animals that do tend to have stereo are most of the predators, primates. At least for the predators, it's useful to have the stereo cue so that you can pounce and attack an animal. If you're prey, it's useful to have the wild field of view so you can run away. So basically, disparity is the main cue to depth, but if you think about it, it's posing the same kind of correspondence problems for the visual system as motion. So you've got two images, you've got two flat views of the scene. How do you align them and come up with the right solution for the depths in the scene? So if you see three dots ahead of you, just flat on a plane, those are the projections in the retinas. The visual system doesn't have any information about the plane, it just has those dots, it has to associate them. So there's actually many different possible associations that it could come up with. There's the correct situation. You could assume in this case that the left-hand dot is perfectly occluded by a new dot, the right-hand middle dot is perfectly occluded by a new dot. There's even more solutions than this, multiple dots. It's the same issue as all the correspondence problems that I discussed with motion. Many, many solutions, no single answer that's correct. So if you're designing a visual system with stereopsis, you could impose a lot of assumptions that would help you solve this. So for example, this is a really strange accidental view where the dots just happen to align. So you could try to minimize assumptions of accidental views. You could use some shortcuts like always match to the closest repetition of this feature, assume minimal disparity. You could add a smoothness constraint, so if you know some of the matches better than others, you could use that to try to solve the ambiguous matches. None of those are completely satisfying, so you want to try to match as much as possible and assume every single feature you see in the two retinas has a match, but partial occlusions are actually pretty common in everyday 3D depth perception. You often have features in one eye that aren't visible in the other because it's slightly occluded. And basically this sort of detect features and then correspond them approach that you might use for a computer vision system doesn't seem to be what the brain is doing. And this was shown pretty elegantly by Ulesh. So he showed people these stimuli which are called random dot stereograms. These are the views that would go to the left and the right eye. You can free fuse them. So if you cross your eyes, or sometimes you can look through the screen, but basically if you fixate at a point that doesn't match the plane of the screen, you should see two versions, or rather three, sorry, of the squares. And if you have some practice, usually you can make the middle one align by just crossing your eyes the right amount. It's a little bit difficult to do, but if anyone can do that, do you see something in there? Yeah, it may be helpful to put something quite close to your face so you train yourself to cross your eyes. Yeah, we're trained to do this in psychology classes, but it does take some practice. What you can see if you can get them to fuse is two squares. Depending on whether you cross fuse or uncross fuse, you will see one square popping out and one square sort of sunken into the display. But the thing to note is the squares are defined by their edges, and none of those edges are visible in the monocular images. I don't think anybody could guess where those squares are going to pop out if you haven't free fused. Yeah, it's actually two. It should be one sort of diagonally against the other. So, but there will always be one popping out, yeah. But the point here is that since the edges are invisible, it's not that you find the square and then notice its disparity in your two eyes and then decide, oh, it must be closer than the background. It's more feed forward. It's almost the other way around, where you have this disparity cue, and due to the arrangement of disparities that you're seeing, you then say, oh, that's a square. So this is kind of similar to the planoptic function approach that I was discussing for motion perception. So remember I said that you have receptive fields that look for certain features in space and time, and you just integrate those to get a feed-forward perceptive motion. But you actually have receptive fields in space and time and disparity. So there are cells in the visual system that have different preferred disparities. So maybe they like a vertical bar moving to the right, but they like it as specific disparity in the two eyes. So again, you have banks of these cells that kind of tile the whole space of motion, edge orientation, and disparities. And these binocular cells actually show up in V1. So you have access to this depth information basically for the entire visual stream in both the ventral and the dorsal stream. V1 cells respond to absolute disparities on the retina, and slightly higher areas respond to slightly more complex depth relations like relative disparity. So both things are at some depth, but one thing's farther behind. So disparity is the main cue that you might use to get 3D structure from your two eyes, but there's a couple of other cues that you can use as well. So one of these is Vergence, and sorry, do you have a question? We touched on this a little bit in the morning session. So as you're moving your eyes to different depth planes, the angle between your eyes has to change. So in this example, if you're fixating on the closed rod, you have a particular angle between the eyes. But what happens if you want to move your eyes back there? In that case, the eyes will have to become slightly more parallel because you're looking at a slightly farther point. And if you look very far away, your eyes become very close to parallel. So this angle between the eyes can also serve as a cue to depth. And another cue that you have is the accommodation. So again, we touched on this in the morning session, but as you're looking at the world, the lens in your eye has muscles that allow it to stretch or shrink, and that allows you to focus on different depth planes. So normally it works with your Vergence cue. So as you move your eyes to focus on a specific plane, you would also adjust the lens to make sure you're getting a nice sharp image of that plane. And one of the results of that is that things on the other planes are not as in focus. So you can use that as an unsigned cue to depth. So things which are either closer or farther than your fixation target are a little bit blurry. This Vergence accommodation is one of the things that kind of gets messed up in modern 3D displays, because you have things that are actually physically located on the computer screen or the TV or the movie screen, but they're also perceived at different depths. So you have to sort of train your eyes to focus on the screen, not at the depth plane. It can get a little confusing, and it's thought to be one of the issues that some people have with 3D screens. This accommodation blur is mostly seen with fairly close targets, because if you're fixating at something really, really far away, the difference in focus between something that's 1 foot closer, 1 foot farther is just not really that noticeable on the retina. But it's quite noticeable at a small scale. So that's the principle behind tilt-shift photography. You're replicating the kind of accommodation blur you'd get if this was really a tiny scene, seen very close within a few inches of your eyes. Oh, yeah?
I may have missed that, but why accommodation is like binocular?
Actually, I was thinking of that as I was saying. I'm not sure it should have gone there. I was thinking because it's related to Vergence and the two signals normally work together in your visual system. But no, you're right. Even if you had one eye, I guess you would still have some Vergence cue. Yeah.
But like for the accommodation, you still have like those difference in blur, right?
Yeah.
One eye.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think both Vergence and accommodation, you could technically solve it with just one eye. But it's the two eyes functioning together. Yeah, so those are the main binocular depth cues, mostly disparity, but also these sort of motor cues from the eyes fixating at different depths. But even if you don't have binocular stereo, you can still see depth quite fine. And in fact, a small percentage of the population actually don't have stereo depth. They're stereo blind. If you have it, you probably wouldn't notice it. I think about the only real-world time you might notice it is for certain sports or for watching 3D movies. One way you can get that is if there's a disruption to your visual system in infancy. So if for some reason the signals from the two eyes aren't able to connect in V1 in infancy, you won't develop proper stereo as an adult. But it doesn't really hurt your ability to see depth or to accurately move and pick up objects in the world. And that's because there's really good monocular cues to depth as well. The absolute most important monocular cue is probably motion parallax. So this is structure for motion. If you've got a camera sweeping around an object, taking different views of an object, you can relate features in those views to compute the 3D structure of the object. And in the real world, objects are constantly moving. You're constantly moving. You can move your head. And this will give you depth perception even if you don't have two eyes. Here's another example, which I think some people saw in the morning session. So hopefully everybody sees this as a 3D rotating object. It's not. It's just dots moving to the left and right. But because it's moving, it gives you a really strong sense that the dots are actually popping out of the screen or receding into the screen as they're sweeping around. And that's purely a structure from motion, because there's nothing else in the scene that would suggest that that's a cylinder. There's no shading. There's no perspective cues. Yeah?
Does everyone see this as rotating to the right?
No, that's a good point. It's actually an ambiguous motion, so there is no signal in that display that tells you which way the cylinder is rotating. One surface is front, one surface is back, but it's up to your brain to decide which. And most people will perceive it shifting eventually, so if you started out with, say, clockwise motion, you'll switch to counterclockwise if you watch it long enough. Sometimes you can make yourself switch by looking at specific dots. Yeah, so it's a really good, you have a strong feed-forward sense of motion from, or of depth just from this motion information, but there's two perfectly good percepts that you can create from it, and they'll feed back down and bias your lower level percept. Another good monocular depth cue is occlusion. So here you probably see a blue square in front of an orange circle. This is only a metric cue to depth in the sense that it tells you who's in front, but it doesn't tell you exactly how far away anything is or how much separation there is between them. It's also a fairly problematic cue to compute feed forward. So you really have to make some assumptions about what objects look like in the world, what is an object boundary and what is not an object boundary. So for example, why not just assume that it's an orange Pac-Man in front of a blue square? So you need to make some assumptions about axonodal views. How likely is it that the hole in the Pac-Man would exactly align with the square? You also have to make some assumptions about what kinds of, say, color changes are likely to be a surface change, a depth change, versus just texture on the object or a logo printed on the object or something like that. So it's a reliable cue, but fairly hard to compute. Another reliable cue, at least for objects on a ground plane, is height in the plane. So in this display, hopefully the third pillar looks like it's slightly behind the other ones. And I actually had to add drop shadows to really imply that they're all sitting on a plane. The heights of the bottoms of the objects are a perfectly reliable cue to depth. Heights of the tops of the objects are not. And I guess the bottoms can be a little problematic if they're weirdly shaped. And speaking of cast shadows themselves are actually a pretty good cue to depth as well. So here I can make the right-hand square seem to pop out from the screen by adding a drop shadow. The more separated the shadow is from the object, the farther it appears to be off of its supporting surface. And since most objects are supported by a surface, cast shadows can be a pretty good cue to depth. They're not fully reliable because obviously in every setting you don't necessarily have any cast shadows. You can also have ambiguous lighting conditions. Here's an example of how that can work. So here, hopefully the third pillar seems to be a bit more in line with the others, maybe not perfectly, but it's not quite as far back as if you give it a drop shadow, so it seems to be on the plane with the rest of the pillars. Another monocular cue that I'm not sure how much it comes up in everyday actions is atmospheric perspective. So atmospheric perspective is light caused by light scattering off the air between you and an object. So it only operates at very, very, very far distances. But the farther distances become more less saturated, lower contrast, and a bit more the same color as the sky or the ambient light. So you can actually see really nice examples of this around the conference. If you go around Salt Lake City, there's some really, really nice vistas of mountains, which will show you some really nice atmospheric perspective. But again, this is only really useful for very distant surfaces where the amount of air between you and that surface starts to matter. Blur is also probably a weak monocular cue to depth. So I said earlier that accommodation blur is an unsigned cue to depth. You don't know if the blurry surface or the blurry objects are closer or farther with accommodation blur. But there does seem to be a tendency, if you show people these kinds of stimuli, for people to say that the blurry thing is in back and the crisp focus thing is in front. And I'm not 100% sure we know why that is. There's a lot of reasons that could be, like in the accommodation situation, you probably have more objects that are behind your target than in front of it. So if you just had to guess, you should assume the blurry things are in back. It could also be sort of a trained thing from photography. People take the central object in focus, and there tends to be more background. Yep?
The fact that the edge is sharp also tell you that it's...
Well, it does sort of make you want to assign it to the front surface, doesn't it?
I don't know if you'd ever see an object in the foreground that was blurry but had a sharp edge.
Yeah, no, that's actually a really good point, and not one that came up when I was reading this paper. Yeah, so when you're looking at objects against backgrounds, you are trying to assign the edges to either the foreground object or the background. And yeah, if the edge has characteristics that make it seem to belong to the foreground object, that's probably a good cue that it is, in fact, the foreground. If it was a blurry object in the front, you're right, it should have a blurry edge. Another good monocular depth cue is shading. So I think in this display, you should be able to see vertical stripes of dots that are bumps sticking out towards you, and then dots that are dents. sort of receding from you. Can everyone see that? Cool. So there's a whole lot of literature on shape from shading, and it's the basic idea is that the light, the shading gives you the normal on the surface. So surfaces that are facing the light are brighter, surfaces that are facing directly away from the light are going to be darker. Once you have all the surface normals, you can kind of use that to reconstruct the 3D surface. It does rely on a lot of assumptions, like in this case, everything's a constant color, everything's perfectly matte, there's no specularities, but it can be a fairly strong cue. Another ambiguity in shape from shading is that you often don't know what the light direction is. So this works pretty well because your brain has a strong assumption that light is going to come from the top of the image. So that's why you see the light above dots as the ones sticking out, hopefully, and the light below ones as the ones receding in. But once you take away the light from above assumption, I think it becomes a lot more ambiguous. So these are exactly the same dots. I've just rotated them all 90 degrees. Can anyone see these as like a nice set of 2x4 vertical stripes? You can. So I had one yes. Personally, I can't. I would really have to force myself to try to see them as being lit from one side or the other. If you don't see stripes, what do you see? All dense, all bumps, all flat? Sorry? They're all bumps? They all stick out to you? Yeah, I would agree with that. I see them all sticking out. Yep?
Is it the fact that the lights are in the room above us? The lights on the floor?
I don't think so, and I'm going to show you why in a second. That's a good point. If I turned off all the lights, maybe you'd be have a little bit easier time actually seeing them as bumps and dips. But that's not the whole story. Yeah, so them all being bumps is not really a good solution to this surface because that would have to assume that the light is coming from the left and then from the right and then from the left and then from the right, which is a little bit strange. I guess you could assume that the underlying surface is somehow flexing so that each part is sort of facing the light in a different way. So that could be one solution. It might not help that I haven't really drawn these dots correctly, so they're just a linear gradient, which is not actually the shading pattern you would get on actual dots if I actually lit them from the side, but that didn't hurt you when I showed the light from above version. So again, that's not the full story. So the demo I want you to try is tilt your head 90 degrees to one side or the other. And try both sides. Can you see them now? Yeah, they come back. But that's a little bit strange, isn't it? Because that means the light's still up here. That means you are now assuming light from over there, which doesn't really seem right. So your light from above prior is really, really quite simple. It's just light from the top of the image, which is not really a correct reconstruction of the world, but it is simple. So it's easy to compute even in a fairly early visual region. You don't need any feedback about which way your body's pointing or which way the world might be oriented. You can just say, okay, everything at the top of my sensor field, light's coming from that direction. So here's one more example of shape from shading. So I think everybody can tell what this is. And if I rotate it around, you should have no trouble telling what it is until right there. So yeah, there's only one lighting solution and one object solution that will solve this. It's a hollow face. So it's like a plastic mask that you could stick on your face. But when it rotates around and you see the inside of the mask, it's really hard to perceive that that's a concave face. And that's because shape from shading has a lot of ambiguities. And part of the way you have to solve it is by using top-down knowledge about the world, what makes sense, what is consistent with the motion cues that you're seeing. And you've never ever seen hollow faces in the world, but you're very familiar with normal convex faces. So you pretty much can't force yourself to see the correct interpretation. You only see the inverted face rotating the wrong direction. Another monocular depth cue that you see a lot in art is linear perspective. So if you've got a structured scene, like an indoor scene, or even some outdoor scenes, buildings, the perspective lines can give you a really good sense of depth. And you can actually build up models. If you have enough lines, you can use them to establish the positions of vanishing points in the scene, then assign the lines to the vanishing points that tells you sort of the normals of the different planes in the scene. You can use that to build up a complete 3D model, at least for scenes that have these nice square structures. That's the Manhattan World approach. Human vision is pretty good at perspective, although there are some weird cases. So you can build stimuli where the perspective cues make sense locally, but when you try to put them together into a global percept, it doesn't make sense anymore. So there may be some range over which you can kind of interpret perspective cues and use them to build a not quite global model of the scene. Another cue to depth is size. If you can see something in the scene that you recognize, or if you have these sort of repeating objects where you can just assume that they're probably the same size, size of the object in the image is a pretty good cue to depth. Again, because it's kind of an ambiguous cue in itself, it's not very strong. It doesn't always work. So for example, if I set it up so that it's a plane, it's closer to you on the left and receding away from you on the right, give you a size cue so that you can see the plane, you probably find it very difficult to see the plane. Whereas when you combine the size cue with height in the plane to make it a little bit more consistent, then you can see the depth. And a related cue is texture gradient. So this is similar to the size cue in that the bits of the texture that are closer are bigger, but again, it has a secondary cue that helps it work, which is that the orientation of texture elements also changes with the surface normal. So the size plus orientation of the disks is telling you the distance plus surface normal at different points on this wavy plane. And that gives you a pretty strong cue to depth. There are also related cues for non-textured surfaces. So the way that reflections change on a surface can also be used as a cue to depth. It's not just size and orientation. And just to sum up, these are all the cues I've talked about so far. This is kind of hand-wavy, so don't assume this is 100% accurate. But basically, each cue has a range over which it's most useful. The Vergence and Accommodation cues, for example, are really best when an object is quite close. Disparity is useful up to a pretty good distance, but at some point, objects are so far away that you don't even get a disparity cue. Atmospheric perspective is kind of the opposite case, where it's only useful for surfaces that are very far away. A lot of the ones that have to do with the plane, like the height in the plane, the cast shadows, can get a lot harder to see when things are very, very far away. Things like occlusion and motion parallax, though, tend to be pretty good at a lot of different distances. Although with things like motion parallax, it depends how far something has moved. You know, very, very small motion, very, very far away, is still not going to be a strong cue to depth. And what's not shown here is the fact that these different cues have different reliabilities over their range as well. So when you're trying to build a coherent perceptive depth from the scene, you can combine all these cues, but you want to weight them by how likely they are to actually be useful or correct in that case. Yeah?
So that's a very nice summary. I like the slide a lot. But what it brought to mind is that in most images, you see more than one cue at the same time.
Yeah.
Do we know much about how these cues interact?
Yes, there's a lot of research on how cues interact. Most of them will combine at least to some extent, but it's very clear that the brain puts more weight on some cues than others. So if you have a stereo cue combined with the other cues, the stereo cue tends to win, which is why you don't see like veridical, honest depth out of these images. Even like you can see that there's supposed to be a change in depth, but nobody sees this actually popping out of the screen towards your face, right? Whereas if you had a stereo cue, if I gave you all 3D glasses, you actually would see this thing in depth. So the stereo cue is quite strong. Motion parallax is also very strong. It can overwhelm other cues. Yeah, but otherwise it's sort of Bayesian cue combination. You're going to use the cue to the extent that it's reliable, which may be why stereo tends to dominate. Yeah?
Is there evidence of other animals having an active
Yeah. So the other primates definitely have like stereo depth, no motion parallax and stuff. Insects have motion parallax. I'm not as sure about stereo depth because they have those weird compound eyes. Not sure about some other things like octopi, but yeah, most animals need some form of depth perception so they can grab prey or just so they don't bump into things. So they have some solutions to it. And what they evolve is probably going to depend on their environment to some extent. Cool. So I think got a little bit of time. So I'm going to say something about how, oh, sorry.
How much of this is learned and how much is innate in our genetics?
So I think the way to answer that is that the tendency to have to look for these cues is in genetics, but they do have to be tuned through experience. So I mentioned that if you, from infancy, have a problem with one eye, so it doesn't give you a combined cue, you don't really develop proper binocular stereo, even though both of your eyes independently function fine. And then if you get a treatment later in life to connect the two eyes, you don't tend to have binocular stereo. So there's at least some tuning, but I don't think you can be like, for example, born with no binocular cells. As long as there's a strong tendency to have these cells, but they will need to be trained a bit with experience. Yep.
Do we have a sense of how long it takes to learn these kind of cues?
I don't know off the top of my head. Infancy. All right, so just a little bit about size. So obviously, size works with depth perception. If you know the size of an object in the scene, you can use that to roughly compute its distance to you. And vice versa, once you have a model of the scene, you can use that to figure out how large everything in the scene is. But size is kind of interesting to me because it's very easy to set up situations where people have wrong percepts of size, even wrong percepts of the size on the image plane. Which is strange because you know it's a flat image, you know its area, but you can perceive all these objects and spatial relationships that won't add up to a flat plane at all, which seems weird because you would expect a good visual system to have a really good, accurate representation of a 2D image, and humans sometimes don't. So here's an example of a case where you don't have a very good percept of this. I asked you which of those two red lines is longer. Just point which way you think. It's like most people like that way. Yeah, I think I would agree. Of course, since this is a classic psychology example, the answer is that they are the same rectangles or the same parallelograms, and those lines are exactly the same length. But it's really quite difficult to see that in the original image. And that's because your percept of the image size is being strongly biased by your knowledge of real-world size. So in the real world, that would be a narrow table on the left and a maybe squarish table on the right, which means the real-world length of those lines are different. The right hand really should be longer in the world. It's just projecting more into the image. And for some reason, when you go back to compute the distances in the image, you can't quite get it correct because you have that bias from the real 3D depth relations in the world. So here's another example of computing size in context. So I think it's going to start off with the classic static version of this. So here, again, the central dots are the same size, but most people say that the one on the right is a little bit bigger. It turns out this effect is much stronger if the dots are moving. So here it's going to loom towards you. Yeah, you should be able to see the small dot shrinking and growing. So that's kind of just the original case made into a video. This one's really cool, though, because here the whole array is moving. And here it's a very, very, very strong percept that the central dot is shrinking as it looms towards you. And the reason for that is that the motion is giving you a really strong cue that that's a single coherent object. So as it looms towards you, if the central dot is getting smaller relative to its surround, it must be shrinking in the world. So you know it's getting smaller. And again, your real-world knowledge that the dot really is getting smaller biases your perception of the whole object. When it's close to you, it has a tiny dot. When it's far away, it has a really big dot. But again, that doesn't line up with what you're actually seeing in the image frames. And here's one more example of that kind of thing. So this is a variation on something called the Ponzo illusion. The original is just these train tracks with sort of two bars, and you see the farther bars being larger. Here you've got a road stretching into the distance and some cars. I think everyone would agree that the farthest back car is clearly bigger than the other ones. But again, of course, it's a psychology test. They're all exactly the same size. And if you don't believe me, it may help to look at just the license plates of the cars. So just really zoom in on those, compare the 3 license plates. It's much easier to see that those are the same size. I think because you don't have as much of the depth perception of the sense of the depth from the surround when you just focus on the license plates. But again, this is sort of interesting because the size of the element should have been a cue to depth. So if you've got repeating objects and they're all the same size, that's sort of a cue that this is just a flat surface with 3 of the same object on it. But I think in this scene, there's so many other cues to depth that you tend to want to see it as a 3D scene with a road receding away from you, and then that biases your perception of the cars, that you actually can't see them as the same size. And here's another really nice example of how your real-world knowledge biases your sense of the scene. So here again, there are tons of cues in this image telling you the real, or what you want to see as the depth percept. So like everyone sees a very small woman on a chair and then a giant woman looking at her. That's not the situation at all, it's something like this. But that's such a weird interpretation of the scene that given the choice between the 2 weirdnesses of a split chair where half the chair is in the background and a woman is sitting on it and another woman is looking at the frame as if there was something on it, that interpretation for some reason loses out to the also improbable situation of there's a really tiny, tiny woman and she's sitting on a chair. And I think even once you know the real situation, it's incredibly difficult to make yourself see it in the original image. Because there are just so many cues. You know what chairs are. Everything is perfectly aligned so that the top of the chair seems to be, has good continuation with the bottom of the chair. It seems to be one object. There's no lighting or shading cues or shadow cues, cast shadows that would dispute this interpretation. So that's what you see, tiny woman. Yeah?
Would this work if I had binocular vision of it?
Yes. If you went to the conference and stood exactly where the cameraman stood, you would be able to understand what was going on here. But once you subtract out that cue, or if you moved, move a tiny bit and this completely breaks down. But yeah, absent those 2 cues. So just to sum up, talked a bit about how you compute depth from binocular and monocular cues. So far and away, the most important cue to depth perception is probably the disparity. And that's due not to finding features in the image and then trying to compute their disparity, but simply due to the fact that you have disparity-tuned cells all throughout your early vision. Even if you don't have binocular cues, there are many monocular cues that you can use to compute 3D depth in scenes. Most important one is motion. But there's also perspective, shading, and texture gradients. And these cues tend to be the ones that we focus on in computer vision systems to compute 3D depth. And depth and real-world object size interact with each other. So your final percept is going to be based on whatever you decide is the most coherent total representation of the scene. And sometimes that means computing the depth and getting wrong information about the size of objects, or even vice versa. Yeah. So any questions?
feel? I don't see so much stretching. I guess everyone is okay, so maybe I should just go. So those of you who still want to stretch can continue stretching. I can speak anyway. It's not a problem. So I realized just a couple of minutes ago that my title is incorrect. I'm not going to talk only about human and non-human primates. There's actually a cat in my talk also. So I apologize for the incorrect title. Visual attention is one of those topics that it's a vast topic if you start looking at the literature. And it's also very confusing literature because there's a tremendous amount of inconsistencies. I probably will add to the confusion a little bit with this, but the hope is that I'm going to be clearing it up for you. And let's see how this goes. So let's start off by talking about a little bit about what is attention and look at some of the classic things that people have done in the field. What's the nature of attention? Well, it's obvious. You've all seen this quote from William James that everyone knows what attention is. But just like everyone knows what attention is, there are people who say that attention doesn't exist. There are people that say that attention is in disarray, that it's inhibition, that it's enhancement, that it's both of them. But my favorite quote is from a review that Stuart Sutherland did in Nature, saying, after many thousands of experiments, we know only marginally more about attention than the interior of a black hole. I don't think it's that bad, but it does reflect the confusion that you see in the literature if you try and simply just read experiment after experiment after experiment. This would be a plea to the community to start thinking about how does one take a body of experiments and create a theory that might explain them. I think we need a little bit more of that kind of activity in the field. Let's look at what a classic thing is that people use often to motivate attention, and that's the cocktail party effect. You've all been to a bar, to a party, and there are people talking all over the place, and somehow, miraculously, the person that's next to you, you can hear exactly what they're saying, and everything else is a blur. Well, for me, everything is a blur. I can't do that at all. So here's the way this goes. I'm going to show you some text, and this is how we're going to simulate the cocktail party. I'll show you some text, and some of it will be in red, and some of it will be in black. The question to you is, read the red text only. You've got to be religious about this. Read the red text only, and then pretend that someone's going to ask you questions about the black text after. I'm not going to actually do it. It'll just take too much time, but I think you'll get the point once you see it. So read the red text only. Did you read anything at all about gold? Lots of black. No, you didn't see the gold. So some of you did because you've seen this before and so forth. But that's the general point. I think that the important thing to note about this is that what I've shown you is I've given you a task where there are distractors, the black text. And I've asked you to ignore the distractors. Thus, you need attention. If you have a task where there are no distractors, you typically do not need attention, and that's been verified experimentally. So that's a critical thing. In computer vision, if we're looking at images that have no clutter, there's no need for attention, really, because you can do those. There's another task that's similar called the shadowing task. Put two different streams of sounds in two different ears, and ask your subject to attend to one of them, and then ask questions about what's in the other. Again, they cannot do it. So these kinds of tasks are the early ones that have been done in the field and motivated the development of what is so-called the early selection model by Broadbent. What he thought is that, well, if we can't do this shadowing task, maybe the senses themselves can filter out what is to be attended, and then only that gets processed afterwards. So thus early selection. So his model included this selective filter very early in the process. Well, other guys said, I'm not so sure about this because often some things I can actually hear from the other ear, and it depends tremendously on whether or not I'm motivated to do so. What is the relevance to me to be able to solve the other task? And thus they came up with a late selection model. Namely, everything gets processed to some degree, but then only after everything gets processed somewhat do we then look at exactly what, a particular task. So that relevance really plays a big role. And that certainly is true to this day in these models. And Treisman thought something, a little bit more radical and said, well, maybe it's all gradual. So, everything gets attenuated a little bit, layer by layer by layer. And certainly one could see that being possibly true also. People also asked about the span of attention. Back in 1859, Hamilton wondered about how many things can we attend to at a time. Is it one? Is it two? Is it three? Under what circumstances? And so forth. Another kind of span of attention is for how long can we attend? And here's an experiment that Norman Mackworth performed in 1943, who, by the way, is the father of a very well-known AI researcher at the University of British Columbia, Alan Mackworth. And he did it in order to test these the young men who were looking for these German submarine signals. And what he found is that you were unable to really attend to things for very, very long, except if you were taking amphetamines. So this has relevance, I guess, for driverless cars, because if you need to worry about for how long can you pay attention while you're actually not driving, it's problematic. If the solution is take amphetamines, that's even more problematic, but that's not it. I think the point here is simply that you need to worry about how much attention can you actually be devoting as a human. There was also another famous model that introduced the word bottleneck from Nakayama, where he talked about these visual feature pyramids as being the input source, and then a very narrow bottleneck that would basically take some kind of an icon that represents what those feature pyramids have extracted and put it into working memory. And that's really, I think, very close to something that we're working on currently. So I think Nakayama had good intuitions from way back. So this attentional bottleneck, one could show it diagrammatically, but the main point to be made is that the brain does not process everything in parallel. That's really the point. So that's why there's got to be something in there that helps control some of this. Here's a little figure from my book that shows you in pictorial form what some of these bottlenecks that we've talked about might mean. But I guess the real question that you might ask is, although these are nice metaphors and they may arise from auditory perception primarily, you can look at some of the papers for computational accounts. Is there an actual bottleneck? This is a very busy slide, so just give me a second in order to get you through it. The answer is that yes, there is an actual bottleneck, and it's because of the boundary problem. What is the boundary problem? To the leftmost panel there, anyone who's run a convolution on an image knows that as you get to the border, you run out of space, and you have a half kernel width where you have no good data. So that creates a little boundary around the second level of representation. The brain has exactly the same problem because a receptive field is got the same characteristics. It still needs to have data. You can't have it overlapping and so forth. So what winds up happening, and if you look at the middle panel, is that half kernel width of the boundary is additive as you go up the visual hierarchy. So as that visual hierarchy changes, by the time you get to the top, you have a substantial area that does not have faithful representation of the data in the image. And that's borne out by the facts that you see in the third panel here on the right, where I've given you the different visual areas and the sizes of receptive fields within those. At the top, what we know is that the central 30 degrees approximately of the temporal areas represent faithfully what's in the image, whereas the peripheral parts beyond that central 30 degrees are not. So then the question would arise is, if I'm processing a full image, how can I possibly get anything outside the central 30 degrees in the brain? Well, the answer is really easy. I move my eyes and bring the central 30 degrees to what I'm interested in. So there you see the point of eye movements. But there's a physical bottleneck for a single image in this sense. In computer vision, we solve this problem by image padding. The brain doesn't have this. There's a nice paper by van der Waal and Burt that I cite there that give a number of different techniques for doing this, mirroring, wraparound, image padding, and so forth, but the brain doesn't have these techniques at all. So what we have here is a clear physical bottleneck. Let me move to something else that one sees quite often in computer vision, and that's salience. So the first thing you want to know about in salience is what's a feature and what attracts. The point is, what attracts? Are there any kinds of features that are better than others for attracting attention? Jeremy Wolf has produced a large body of work in attention. I guess just about all of it really good. So if I had one person in psychology to point you to, I'd point you to Jeremy Wolf's work. And part of that is to look at exactly this question. And what he found is that just about any kind of feature that you want to test under the right conditions will attract your attention. Some of them more than others, like flashing red light and so forth, as we all would guess. But just about everything captures attention in one way or another. This is reflected in this model of Treisman's that includes this master map of locations. We'll come back to this shortly, but the main point here is that what she believed is that there is a representation of all of the locations in the visual field, and that somehow encapsulates which positions have salient items. And depending on those, I can then determine what to process next. That led immediately to a computational counterpart in what is a very, very well-known model, the saliency map model of Christoph Koch and Shimon Ullman, where they basically wanted to computed a saliency map which represented conspicuity at a point. Conspicuity in this case is contrast between the center and the surround, and ran a winner-take-all process to choose the point of highest conspicuity. That point then would be the one that determines what features from the image are extracted and passed on to higher processing. So this was a completely feed-forward pass in terms of doing the saliency work. Fecto and Munoz looked at this and thought, well, there's something missing here. And I'll remind you of what we talked about for the late selection model about relevance. The idea of what is important for me to look at has to play a role. It's not simply what is attracting my saliency in a bottom-up fashion, but also what is it that I want to look at, because I can kind of suppress some things sometimes. So their particular incarnation expanded the idea of a saliency map into a priority map. And they looked at brain areas and found candidates for them in the superior colliculus and so forth. So this is my preference, is that I think it's a priority map that we're really looking for here. A lot of people have looked at where in the brain the saliency map exists. Here are a lot of candidates in the brain for this saliency map. I particularly don't like most of them, I guess, if I had to choose, because I think the experiments are not really done in the right way. Why? Because all of these experiments, they simply look across a representation and ask, is there a peak in response to neurons across this representation where I am attending? Must be the saliency map. Well, no, because that's not the case. That probably exists everywhere. The role of saliency, in my view, is something like this. It really is a confluence of a number of different representations. One of them is a conspicuity map, very much like the Koch and Ullman one, however, constructed differently, namely looking separately at the peripheral maps and central maps. In other words, doing feature-based attention in the periphery and object-based attention in the central area. Then you have to use the idea of priority, but not only priority, but also history. What have I seen already that I don't need to see? That modulates what I'm looking at. What do I need to see that I haven't seen already? That modulates things. And sometimes I'll need to see something again and again in order to make sure that I get it right. Just think about if you had to look at, if you had to sort of estimate the distance between two objects metrically, you'd sort of go back and forth a little bit and you'd estimate that distance. So that's where that comes in. So I think the role of saliency is closer to this. Visual search is another one of these domains where there's been a tremendous amount of experimental work. And let's start with looking at what attentional cueing is, because that's a key part of some of these experiments. This is a classic experiment by Posner and colleagues. And what they did is they asked subjects to fixate on a cross in the center of the image, and then there would be a target that would appear on one side or the other. And they would have to move their eyes to the target. On some of the trials, they would provide a cue, where the cue says, the target that you want is on that side. The target that you want is on that side. And then they measured how long it takes them to actually perform the experiment. And what they found is if they gave you a valid cue, that you were much faster than if they gave you an invalid cue. You're also more accurate. So this is the prime example of cueing, where I can give you a cue and that will set up your attentional system in order to perform a task more quickly and more accurately than otherwise. So this is part of a lot of experimental work where subjects are always given a cue of some sort. The classic visual search experiment looks like this. Look at the top left only to start with. This is called a feature search, where I have a number of stimuli there, and the target is distinguished from the distractors by a single feature, in this case, color. The one below, the target is distinguished from the distractors by two features, color and orientation. And what classic experiments, such as those that Ann Treisman and many others have done, show is that if we plot the response time versus the number of elements in the display, for the feature search, you get a low slope, low to zero slope kind of a line. And for the conjunction search, you get a much higher slope. So what they did is they thought, oh my, I know what this means. It means that for features, it doesn't matter how many items I have in my display. They just pop out, regardless of the number of distractors in the display. Whereas for a conjunction search, I need to do a serial search amongst them, and it's sort of when it ends, I found it. So it's a self-terminating serial search. And that was the conclusion from this body of experiments that one sees in psychology textbooks to this day. It's really something that is very difficult to defeat. And it led to this model called the feature integration model, which I've said something about already. So as you'll see, you'll have access to the slides. I just tried to provide you with a lot of references in the slides for you to look at further. Jeremy Wolf has a similar model. He added what the feature integration model did not have is if you look here, it's entirely feed forward. From the representation of objects up here, there was no top-down component that would in any way affect those decisions on the master map. Whereas for Jeremy Wolf's, he did add the top-down commands from the object. So that's a big difference that he added. And then he added this other idea that, well, attention is a long drawn-out process. I have pre-attentive things that I find with, they're very quickly. Then I have attentive things that need serial processing. And then I have post-attentive things that kind of wrap up processing and put things into representations. So I think really that's the kind of thing that one should be looking at. The problem with this particular interpretation is that it's very difficult from the search slopes to actually be able to infer process. Because that's what they were doing. They were inferring the algorithm just by looking at the response times. And as you see here, this is a plot of some experimental work. There are efficient searches, quite efficient searches, inefficient searches looking for a T among Ls, very inefficient searches. And the way this was then extended is in this really terrific paper by Jeremy Wolf, where he looked at 1 million published trials of visual search experiments, looking for a distribution of response times that had two modes, the fast mode and the slow mode, and did not find it. So that does not exist. And in fact, there is a complete continuum of different response times depending on the particular kinds of images, the particular numbers of distractors, how complicated the stimuli are, and so forth. So it's a much more difficult problem than was originally believed with this simple feature and conjunction search idea. You've seen already what experimental setups look like in the previous talks, so I need not talk about here. But I think I wanted to make just one point by showing this, and that's this. that in computer vision we often derive inspiration from these experiments. But what we don't do is then replicate the scenario under which the observations were made, right? So you can't just take, oh, this is happening, but ignore the fact that, well, the subject was fixating and could not move their eyes, and they were given a cue, and there was a certain amount of time that they had to do the processing, and so forth. So all of that, I think, has to play a role in how, if we're going to interpret the human data correctly in building computer vision models. Attentional blink is another one of these attentional phenomena that has attracted a lot of attention. I didn't mean that at all, so I should probably pass over this. But the idea here is that if I show you this sequence of different stimuli that is shown at the top left, and I ask you within that to be able to detect a particular target, and you do that very well if it appears very quickly in that stimulus. If I ask you then to tell me about a particular other object that's after the target and vary the amount of time that it takes to present it, then you become quite poor at it during a particular interval of time. And the explanation would be is that, well, you are still processing the previous one, so you're not allowing yourself enough time to do that overall processing. Exactly how we could incorporate that into anything in computer vision, I don't really know, other than the fact that this tells us that to attend to something takes time, and you cannot ignore that amount of time. Change blindness. Well, this is embarrassing because I have one of the authors in the audience, Jim Clark. So I should just let him do this before I make a mess of it, but change blindness, it's been observed that people are poor at detecting change if old and new displays are separated by more than a certain amount of time. So let me just give you an example. Something changes in this display. Those of you who may have seen it before will see it again, but it took me a really, really long time to find this one. Once you find it, you'll never miss it again. Everybody get it? Anybody get it? Ah, come on. Huh? It's nothing? No, I'm sorry. Hmm?
Second image white.
It's interesting that if you showed these images without the blank in between, you'd get it right away. It's the blank that's required. You found it? There. Okay. How does that happen? How does that work? I think that's really an interesting kind of a question. And the thing, I guess the important thing is that attention is needed to perceive the change. If you're not attending to that location in order to detect that change, you're not going to find it. So we're not looking at an image like this and extracting a complete representation of all the features that you can then compare to the next one, which if you had them, which should be easy to do. So the brain's not doing this. It's doing something else. Okay, so I think that's what it points out. When you attend, attention has a spatial footprint, and there have been a lot of optical metaphors for spatial attention. So these are all theories of attention in space. So one of them is spotlight. I'm sure everyone has heard about the spotlight of attention. So it basically says that across an image, you have a spotlight of attention, and that's kind of the cross-section of it, and it's due to Schulman and others. There's also the zoom lens that allows you, that says that you kind of zoom into what you're interested in. There's a gradient attentional footprint as well, and there's a suppressive surround. So there may be others, but these I think are the main ones that are out there. So let me just show you what these would look like. So that's what a spotlight would look like if I have a picture. This is a picture of a pigeon. So that's spotlight would do this. Highlight one part of the image. Gradient would do this. A zoom lens would do this. What's wrong with all of these? The thing that's wrong with all of these is that when you look at the actual image, you don't only see what's in the little hole. Everything else is still there. I mean, how do we do that? By having a spotlight.
How does foveated attention factor into this? You do have sharp foveated vision popping around.
So all of so we have a fovea, and everybody is fixated on the center of the image. So the fovea is at the center of the image, and all of these images, the vast majority of these experiments are done that are mostly foveal, so that you see a display and you're a certain amount, a certain distance from the display, so they're within 10 degrees, 12 degrees, so it's not out there. You see what I mean? So the suppressive surround one, on the other hand, it just says, okay, well, I'm going to suppress the surround and leave everything else alone. Why does that make any sense at all? Think about the structure of a convolution, a receptive field. A receptive field in the brain would look at a particular region of space, as Drew mentioned in his talk. So if I have a couple of different items in there and I want to attend to one of them, the other one is a distractor. So I have a single receptive field with two elements in it. Both of them are now feeding the neuron that belongs to that receptive field. The only way I'm going to be able to clean that up is by suppressing the distractor. And that way allow only the one that I'm interested in to feed that neuron. So that's the point that, behind the suppressive surround. So we wanted to do some experiments on this as well. So in order to verify that that's indeed what humans could be doing. So with my postdoc, Florent Kutsu, we did an experiment. It goes like this. Suppose I'm asking you to fixate that black dot in the center, and I show you a cue, that gray disk on the side, and I tell you to attend to that cue. In other words, put all of your spatial attention onto that cue, because in that cue position, a letter will appear. There's going to be a bunch of other letters, but that one really matters. That's an important letter, a reference letter, that then you have to compare to a probe letter in all the rest. So now if the theory of this suppressive surround idea is true, what would happen is that as you attend to that, you're attending to that gray disk and suppressing the surrounding area of the gray disk. So when I then put up other elements, any elements that appear within the suppressed area should be more or less invisible to you. The only ones that should be visible are the ones that are further away. So that's what the test display would look like. So that's the letter that corresponds to my cue location. If it has a suppressive surround, maybe those two would be within the surround and not so visible. And the only way I could compare the probe and the test is if they were far enough away. So then and then there's a mask to stop the process. So when we plot accuracy, you get this. This is the separation in terms of one diameter of this display. This is accuracy. 55% is here. So when you're nearby, you in fact are quite poor at this. And only after you get outside of the suppressive surround do you improve. So this appeared in vision research. There's been, I don't know, I was counting at one point, but I got to 50 papers that replicated this, so I stopped, figuring, okay, this is now done. Then we did some neurophysiology on this using MEG, and this is with some colleagues in Magdeburg, where we showed this display. This is a half circle. Subject is fixating at that corner, and they are all rotated letters C. And what you had to do is, for a particular one, be able to say in which orientation is it. While you're doing that, and completely unrelated to the experiment, that white ring gets flashed at the same position. So what does that tell us now? Suppose that this same position is where the letter C is that you're supposed to do your task at. That would mean then that if the theory is right, the nearby items would be suppressed. So when that flashes, then everything so it should come through clearly because you're attending to that location. If I'm attending to that location it means then that the nearby ones are suppressed. So when that white ring flashes, it should be suppressed, and you won't see much of a brain response for that white ring. Okay? And that's exactly what we found. So this is the center position. These are the neighboring positions. These are the other ones. So this is using magnetoencephalography, so it's a neurophysiology response that shows exactly the same sort of surround suppression as we saw psychophysically. Why does this matter? It matters for the reason that I tried to describe earlier. Surround suppression helps reduce local receptive field clutter. So that's the mechanism that the brain uses, and the important thing is that it also takes time to do all of that. I'll show you some more of this later. Eye movements. There are lots of kinds of eye movements. In computer vision, we kind of think about only saccadic eye movements. And even that we try to ignore as much as possible. If you're doing robotics, if you're trying to put vision algorithms on a robot has to move their eyes, but again, you know, with the advent of Kinect and so forth, and other sorts of sensors, we kind of try to ignore eye movements as much as possible. But humans have a wide span of different eye movements. And a lot of these eye movements play a role in a lot of different things. You heard a little bit about Vergence from Krista. The torsional control helps when you're looking off axis, and so forth. So I won't go into details, but I did want to point out that it's a broad and complex topic to talk about eye movements themselves. You've all heard about how we scan images. This is an example of a typical scan path for an image where the black lines correspond to where your eyes go, and you know, they keep coming back to interesting things. In this case, the eyes would be interesting. I know that one paper that played a big role in motivating me to start my career in this direction is this one by Noten and Stark, and in 1971, when I was, you know, a nice formative undergraduate student, you know, doing my first readings. And I saw this. This was great, and there must be some way of connecting this to computers as well. So what they found is that they were able to, they looked at images of this sort and found that people had particular scan paths. And that when they were asking people to learn those images, they had particular scan paths that they would learn. So that's amazing. They thought that what we do is we learn a scan path, and then when we want to re-recognize the object, we execute that scan path. So we store that as a representation in the brain of that particular scan path. So it would look something like this. Unfortunately, it's been pretty much refuted that this is the case, because it doesn't take a scan path in order to recognize images. You can do this. There was some mention of this earlier about short amounts of time to categorize, and I think the record is currently 13 millisecond exposure for an image in order to be able to do categorization. No time for eye movements. So the idea that we store a particular sequence of eye movements with an object as a means to recognizing it is just not the case. It was unfortunate, since this was my motivation anyway, but what can I do? What is the case, though, is that task plays a big role with eye movements. And Yarbus has this classic book where he showed a particular single image to people, and he asked them various questions. And based on the questions that you see on the side, you had different sets of scan paths that are demonstrated here. And what this shows you is that there is a tremendous influence of why you're looking at an image on how you look at the image. It's not the case that you look at an image you know, in a feed-forward fashion and be able to answer all questions. You have to be able to tune how you're going to look at those images. Not only do we have eye movements, but we have something called covert attention. This was discovered at least as early, well, Helmholtz wrote about it. I'm sure the ancients had discovered it as well. But what he did is he just sort of created a flash of light on a printed page, and then realized that even without being able to see it, he was able to sort of look on that page. So look covertly without eye movements. Covert means without eye movements in this case. So that's interesting, and when you try to think about how you build a covert eye movement into any kind of a theory, it starts to become a little bit complicated. We've tried that, and we have something that we kind of like so far, but I think you have to start from the premise that the purpose of any saccade is to bring new information to the retina. So where in the retina? Well, to the fovea. Where exactly in the fovea? Because the fovea is not just a point. So it turns out that this is a diagram of the sensitivity of the fovea, and that's where the point of fixation is. So the sensitivity drops off pretty quickly as soon as you get outside, even though you still have lots of cones there and so forth. So the point of maximum information gain would be this one, if you're going to move your eyes. You can move your eyes very small amounts in order to move this around. If I'm trying to inspect all the different squares on this microphone, for example, the amount of eye movement is really small. Less than a degree, maybe a degree or two at most, and so forth. So all of those would be called microsaccades, and there's a nice literature on those as well. Jim Clark has also done some of that. Did I cite you here, Jim? I should have. So I should cite you as well. So the point here is that the experiments that we were talking about with visual search and most psychophysics try to eliminate the microsaccades as being because there's an additional complication with microsaccades. Not every microsaccade has attentional purpose. Some of it is there in order to compensate for the natural drift due to eye muscles. So that drift and the attentional movements cannot be easily separated. So during an experiment, you try to eliminate those. So even though some experiments say they're covert attention, those small motions that I think are the really interesting ones are always removed. So I think that there's quite a bit of interesting work to be done there still. Inhibition of return. Well, if I've already looked at Jim, sorry to pick on you, Jim, for a third time, but what can I say? I've done it, so I've already looked at him. Why do I have to look at him again? Inhibition of return. If you look at the winner-take-all algorithms that people classically have used for saliency maps, if you leave the winner in the pool that you choose from, you'll only always choose the winner. You have to remove the winner from the pool in order to get the second winner, in order to get the winner, right? So that's where the mathematical version of inhibition of return can come in. But also experimentally, it's been shown, Klein is one of the main people working in this area, that once you've looked at something a bit, there's a tendency to not look back there again. It can be overridden by task, but that tendency is definitely there. So how do you integrate all these different types of eye movements? And there have been a number of ideas that have appeared in the literature. All of these do not have a mechanistic counterpart. I think it's important to be looking at these and try to find a mechanistic counterpart, something that has an algorithm that can be realized and tested before one goes further, and none of these do. We have one that we've been flogging for a short amount of time. It looks very complicated. The table of numbers also looks complicated, but I think my students are presenting this in the next day or two somewhere here, so you can go there. But I think the main point I want to drive is that with this more complex version of saliency that I showed you earlier, peripheral, central, and history and task influences on a priority map, one is able to get results that are virtually identical to human results for saccade prediction. Brain areas. I have, 5 minutes? 10 minutes. Well, you've seen these brain areas in other talks already. So all I wanted to say as well is that there's been a tremendous evolution of these kinds of diagrams. Here's a 1983 diagram. Here's a diagram that I know you've seen earlier today. On the side, I've got some of the statistics. I guess the important things are that there are a tremendous number of connections that are reciprocal. It's not a one-way diagram or anything like that. There's a tremendous amount of feedback and also same level recurrence going on here. There are also, you've seen in previous talks, the what and where pathways. So I just thought I would complicate things a little bit more by adding the when pathway in there too, which is a more recent invention. I find these a little bit difficult to deal with because you can take them too literally. You can take them as if anything to do with location is somewhere else. It's not over here. So I think that's a little bit too literal. I mean, everything has some location in it. Everything has some feature selectivity in it. So don't take these too literally when you see them in these experiments. And then, of course, things get more complicated. I just include these here for your interest. You can look them up and see them. Here, things get very complicated, but Markov and their colleagues, here's a flattened map of the monkey cortex and a matrix that shows you the strength of connection between areas. So there is little there that could tell you how exactly to draw a hierarchy, because all of the connections are there, and they're all of differing strengths. So creating a nice pipeline of layers really has very little to do with how the brain is constructed. And here's another example of where the reciprocal connections are in the brain, again, very recent, but also an example here of showing that many areas have only top-down connections, only top-down connections. So we have to think about all of these things when you're actually looking at building an architecture in computer vision. I'm showing you these because I'm talking about attention. So the point is that within this backdrop, we have a number of authors that look at creating an attentional network. So what Posner on one side and Vossel and others on the other side have tried to do is show which brain areas seem to be involved in attentional tasks. These are all done using various brain imaging experiments. And I, again, don't find them as useful as they might be if they were more closely associated to a mechanistic explanation of how that attentional function comes about by connecting those particular areas. Here's just something for your interest of kind of a nice survey paper by Stuart Shipp that shows some nice diagrams done in a common fashion for a variety of different attentional models. And you can look that up. I give you the citation. Attention in single neurons. So this is actually really important, and if I have only a few minutes, I'll use them all here. It first started in 1956 when Hernandez-Peón looked at a cat, and this is the cat that ruined the title of my talk, so this is the cat. They looked at the cochlear nucleus, so in the ear, and they would put, let the cat listen to these clicks, so that what the cat, and then record from the cochlear nucleus, and every time there was a click, there would be a spike in the response of those neurons. They then got the cat to attend to a mouse. So they put a mouse in front, cat paid attention to the mouse. Clicks still happened, but did not appear at all in the cochlear, in the neurons. So this showed to them that they were able, with an attentional task, to modulate single neurons. Now, if you think about it, that's pretty amazing, because when you go back to David Marr's book, there was nothing in there whatsoever about any aspect of modulation from the top. So that tells you that it's possible that the neurons in the brain are dynamic and plastic at all times. And that's what complicates things from the perspective of modeling. The temporal synchrony model is something that you may have heard of, and the idea here is that people believed that objects are represented by collections of neurons that all fire together. So they fire in some synchronous fashion. And there's been a lot of experimental work that looks at oscillations of this sort, and they have found oscillations with different frequency bands. Each of those frequency bands would have a particular purpose to them, a particular functionality. And there's ongoing research there. So I just wanted to mention that. That one seems to me a little bit more difficult to see how we could use it in computer vision. The bias competition model, though, is one that I think that continues what I mentioned with Hernandez-Peón, but in V2 and V4 neurons in the monkey. And what they did is they found a receptive field in an area, and they then determined what an effective stimulus for it is. So in this case, it's that blue bar, and with that stimulus, that neuron fired strongly. They then put a stimulus which was ineffective in the receptive field, the red vertical bar. and found that the neuron fires weakly. So then they thought, I wonder what would happen if we put them both in. And that's what they did. They put both in and found that the response was intermediate. This is not max pooling. So there is no max pooling in the brain. So I just wanted to say that. And then they trained the monkey to be able to attend to one or the other. And I'm sure you can guess what the punchline is, since I've been emphasizing modulation. If I tell the monkey to attend to the effective stimulus, well, it's still there, so clearly that neuron should respond well, and it does. If I tell the monkey to attend to the ineffective stimulus, the effective one is still there, but the monkey's neuron does not respond. It responds as if it saw only the ineffective. So it's as if it would create an apparent receptive field that looks like that. In other words, it's causing that receptive field to change its properties dynamically based on the task, moment to moment, to be attentive to only the thing that the instruction tells it. So that's a pretty big deal if you think about it, because this really confirms that the visual system, all the way, and although in this experiment they found the major effect in area V4, I'll show you later that the Aziz effects have been found now in just about every visual area where they've been looked for. And the important thing, again, to note, to add to this, is that attention takes time. It's not as if this happens instantly. It happens basically on a feed forward and on the downward pass. So on a second pass downwards, as you see, this is a diagram of the no attention case, and this is a diagram of the attentive case. And you see the difference is in this response where the attention modulation occurs after about 150 milliseconds, and importantly, after the stimulus disappears even. That neuron is still changing. So attention takes time. Single neurons are modulated pretty much anywhere in the visual stream. This is from a paper from Kastner's group. You see here a bunch of different visual areas from LGN onwards. They note attentional enhancement in some neurons, suppression in some neurons, and even baseline increases, namely resting rate increases due to attention. And Schroeder's group looked also at different visual areas and plotted regular responses versus attentive responses. And the interesting thing to note here is that the direction of these responses are from top down. The highest level neurons start showing their attentional modulation very early, while the earliest in the visual system, LGN, is the latest. So there's a complete reverse direction of how those responses appear due to attentive modulation. So we did an experiment also on this. We did the same thing that I showed you earlier with the MEG recordings to find the suppressive surround, but this time what we did is vary the timing of that white ring. So we changed the time to the white ring to see when exactly in the process does that make a difference, and found this for the different timings. So when you got to 250 milliseconds is when you saw the major change right in here. And you can demonstrate this by looking at a plot of the magnitude of responses across the brain. So that's a half a brain, the left side of the brain, you're looking at it from the back side. So this area here would be V1. So responses start in V1, start moving over to associative cortex, and then come back, which shows you that attentive recurrence due to modulation. And I won't go through that because I want to talk about control. Attention needs control. I need control to not talk too much. So I'll just pass over this. You can look at these. But I think the important thing I want to show you is this one last slide, which you're going to hate me for because it's a terrible slide. And that's why I'm giving you the slides. I wanted to make a point about what all the different dimensions of attentional functionality in humans are. And it's not simply find a region of interest. There's an awful lot more to it than that. And this is why you need control. You need something in there that will be able to take all of these different dimensions of attentional impact and decide which to apply, when and how, and to which stimuli, and how do you process it. And that's what the function of an executive controller would be. You can get all of these citations if you easily once you look them up. And for further reading, I point you to a variety of sources there. And thank you, and hope I didn't eat into your coffee time too much. If you have any questions, I'm happy.
So you mentioned earlier about the tension and how the experiments we're using for trying to see if they mimic, say a deep network mimics attention, isn't set up the same way. What suggestions would you have to actually set up like a deep network experiment to try to mimic these experiments for like fixation and stuff?
So we're actually busy doing all of those things. I think is it here that so we've looked at, for example, how you take a deep learning network and add priming to it. So I would look, my suggestion would be that you look at a particular dimension of this attentional impact and start thinking about, well, if I wanted to add priming, what would I have to do? If I wanted to add inhibition of return, I think that one's an easy one, what would I have to do? The biggest one is that if you want to get closer to why we need many of these attentional things, you have to do away with some things, which that impact, I don't know what it would have. So for example, you'd have to do away with any kind of max pooling. Brain doesn't have this. You'd have to do away with the image padding. Again, I'm not sure what would happen there. So it would be a very different structure of network. So I would be very keen to see if powerful algorithms like backprop and so forth, if you structure the network differently to make it look more like the brain, whether or not they still would have the same impact. I think that would be very interesting.
But there's also stuff like a temporal component to this, like when you're
Oh,
fixing this up, and
absolutely.
not to mention just attentional focus and other stuff you'd have to add into the model to have it actually try to actually model the human attention.
Yeah, the temporal dimension has been very poorly studied on the computer vision side, but even on the computational neuroscience side, the temporal component seems to stymie us because if you want to start getting closer and closer to what the brain is doing, earlier in the day it was mentioned about magnostream versus parvo. Well, not only do they have different characteristics, they have different timings. Their transmission speeds are different. I mean, there's just so much that goes on in time that we haven't looked at that would be really interesting to see what exactly could be gained on the computer vision side by taking some of those things into account.
Yeah, and also the two-way network as well. I mean, it's a completely different fundamental structure of a network.
Yeah.
So to try to say, like, I would think it's good to say it shares some aspects to it, but it's not to say it actually represents it or models it would be a step too far.
What we have currently in the deep learning world shares some aspects of what Hubel and Wiesel found, but we've learned an awful lot more since the late 60s.
Yeah, this is a great talk. I think like you mentioned in the beginning, there's almost like a Tower of Babel effect of what's attention. And in your talk, it seems like you can have it on a very small scale, like if you just look for edges and like if you do edge detection, it's your own attention on its own area. On a very higher level, if I'm tracking something that's very cognitive functional. So it sounds like attention, if I'm trying to spans many scales.
That's why when I talked about Treisman's 1964 attenuated theory, I said that she had it going across the scales, and that I think was right. That's what I meant, is that attention can play a role at many different levels of processing.
Yeah, exactly. Different layers of like abstractions.
Yeah.
And then it seems to me that, for example, as you get into a lot of the higher level ones, when you say put your attention on something, it seems like you have to start to introduce a goal, right? In the sense of there's a reason, there's a goal for why an organism might pay attention to something in the scene. Maybe it's tracking it, maybe it's tracing whatever. And I don't know, maybe that's something that modulates.
Goals play a huge role. You're absolutely right. Most of the in most of the experimental work, it's rarely the case that you tell a subject, okay, just be. That's not done. You give it an image, you give them a reward. There's something to do. I mean, even in your everyday life. I mean, it's rare, although you do it, where you sit on a beach and go, It's lovely. You know, your goal is to feel good still. I mean, there's still a goal that plays a role. So I think it's hard to extract goals completely, but having them there, they do play a giant role in how you determine what is going to be modulated, how you're going to dynamically tune your visual system for that particular task.
Right, right. And then the final part of that, basically, like, going off that, the question was, are there kind of like low-level type of goals that are very important for organisms? Like I think previously we talked about motion segmentation. That seems to me is a form of attention in a sense, and a very primitive one. Primitive, not the simple primitive that is very useful, right, across the board. Do you see that?
Yeah. I think that there's attention that's involuntary and attention that's voluntary. So the involuntary things, I think, are just built into the system. They try to, sharpen, contrast, tune things and so forth, but they're not under your direct control. They just happen anyway. And those are the ones that you might see, say, between two visual areas, any looping between two visual, they're probably happening there. The ones that are from higher levels of cortex would be the volitional ones that relate to your task.
Thanks for the great talk. I had a question about the part that you mentioned, tracking the eye movement, and you said for different tasks it's like different. I was wondering if there has been any studies on why these are different and what is the relationship between each kind of movement and the task that it's trying to solve. So
you're talking about the Yarbus task where I mentioned that. So there they only looked at saccades. They didn't look at other forms of eye movement. But if you look at the question, so for example, one of the questions was, which was the person who most recently came into the room, if I remember correctly. So basically what you're doing there is you're looking at the people. You're not going to look at the curtain. You're not going to look at the floor, right? You're looking at the people and you're trying to figure out characteristics that might signal to you that they just came in the door. Maybe they've got their coat on, right? Something like that. So the task is very connected to where you're going to wind up looking. That's what they basically found. So algorithms, computer vision algorithms that involve task guidance in saliency, where, I mean, even without eye movements, I think that there just aren't so many of them. I really like the work that Vidya Navalpakam has done with Laurent Iti. I think she was on a really good start and then, finished. I mean, sometimes people just should never finish their PhDs because they're really doing a really good job and they should just keep doing it. At any rate, I would recommend you take a look at what she did because I think that that's kind of on the right track of how exactly to bring task information into those algorithms.
When I was doing the red and black task,
I'll come closer.
Yeah. When I was doing the red and black word test here at the beginning, I found it actually I felt tired and it was hard work. And I'm wondering, is there, what's going on there? What is actually the sense of exhaustion you get by doing attention? Why is attending something, particularly if you're suppressing neuron firing so there's less energy being used by the brain?
When's the last time you had a coffee?
Well, I've had it probably without coffee, but yes,
So it's a very unnatural task, though, because what you're being asked to do is read, which we normally do just by moving our eyes left to right and so forth. Read, but skip stuff. So it's very unnatural to do that, and I think that that's really the one source that you might find that's tiring. The other is the fact that you had to suppress black in favor of red all the time. And again, that's an unnatural sort of a task. Beyond that, I wouldn't know what else to comment on that.
is attention exhausting in general? When you have to pay attention, you said earlier about the soldiers looking at the maps, they struggled to do it for more than 30 minutes. Is there a sort of exhaustion happening there?
Well, the vigilance tasks are completely different than the sort of dynamic attention for a single image, because those require you to do a particular thing for an extended period of time. So that's a different thing, and I don't really know. But I can tell you that the kinds of attentional experiments people do where there's brain imaging, you do see, you know, blood flow in the brain in different areas due to attention. So it does use up some energy. Whether or not that's an exhausting thing after a few minutes, I really couldn't say. I just don't know. But I appreciate what you're saying, because at least, you know, for these very unnatural tasks, whenever we do experiments, you know, in the lab, psychophysical things, and we ask subjects to do things that are unnatural, they do get tired and they do have to take breaks.